everyone. This is going to be our next segment about tools. Today we're going to talk a little bit about some different wire strippers, and we've actually got quite a few. A couple of automatic versions, and honestly some that are crap that you should probably just avoid. And before I get too deep into that, I wanted to mention that we're using a couple of different things than we have in the past. I noticed some audio sync issues that I tried to connect. I noticed some audio sync issues that I tried to correct in post the past couple of times using NDI coming out of one of the Cat S62 devices. Overall, generally happy with that setup, but just trying to move things a little bit forward, and I think we've actually ended up stepping sideways. I've got a Panasonic AW-HE50, which is a fun little RoboCam, but it only shoots 1080p, 1080 60i. So if we see any interlacing artifacts with this, I may just give up on that, which is a shame. I had to go buy an AC adapter for it. I found it as a spare in a supply closet. And although it may fix my audio sync issue, I think it's introducing a couple of others. I had a bit of a harder time than usual getting the green screen color adjusted for it. But anyway, so wire strippers. I think I mentioned during one of my videos that I carry this pair with me in my tool bag every day. This is the Doyle Multifunction Electricians Pliers, technically, not really a wire stripper. I also used to carry this. This is the old Pittsburgh self-adjusting wire stripper that Harbor Freight carried, and there was an unboxing I did a while ago, and I guess a review of sorts of the Quinn upgraded version of that. This is really just a nicer, newer version of the same tool. And all of these have things I like about them, and then these are probably the versions you're more familiar with. So this is the worst thing that could ever still be considered a wire stripper. This is a stamped piece of sheet metal, basically, that they paint and coat. It has what it claims to be a bolt cutter. I've never had much luck with those. And different crimpers and things built into it. And they're honestly garbage. I threw out all of mine. I had to borrow these from someone. This is actually a slightly nicer than normal pair. It's got these cushioned handles. And these are most commonly found in various tool kits. So you very rarely, although I have seen them, but you'll very rarely want to buy a pair of these independently. It'll come in like a 151 piece kit of splice connectors or some form of terminal that, my first electronics kit type of thing, where they want to include something but don't want to actually invest in something good. Next up from that is you'll see pairs like this in a lot of kits as well. You notice this one's pretty beat up. These are once again just kind of cast in the shape they are. They're not ground. You've got paint on all the surfaces. Strippers like this, and actually this one right above it is a nicer version. You'll also see in some low-end electronics kits. This set here, not bad. It solid stranded, typical marks. We do still get a couple of bolt cutters, and this is the first point where we see, and I'm going to put this on the focus camera so you can see what I've been talking about, putting these two side by side, where I have painted surfaces on all of my cutting and crimping edges, and in fact the non-insulated crimps are a lot sharper than they should be. On this particular example, compared to this, which has that polished surface, meaning that those were ground after, and this is going to tend to cut much cleaner and strip much cleaner, whereas this, even if this had been ground, which I highly doubt that it was precision ground in any form of, in anything that could be considered like that, is still got that layer of paint. The other thing you'll notice is the cutting surface on this. Now, this isn't always a bad thing. The self-adjusting strippers use the same cutting surface, but this uses an anvil and blade style cutting surface, which, especially for smaller gauge wires, does not work very well. Whereas anything that is just a dedicated stripper like this, you'll notice that the cutting surfaces cross each other. Now, for large gauge wire, which I'd say, 14 gauge and up generally, this will work fine. But you're not going to be happy trying to cut insulated 22 gauge wire with it. And I don't even know how they think you're going to strip 22 gauge wire on something where the stripping surfaces don't actually meet with each other. So that's just a lovely addition. Next up, I mentioned these self-adjusting wire strippers. Now these are a bit different in that instead of having a ground set of blades that meets to strip the wire, these just have teeth and a cutting blade that are supposed to grab it and automatically pull it open. This particular model is sintered and sharpened. This particular model just has a cutting blade inserted in it. Functionally, the Quinn is supposed to be higher end. I haven't had a whole ton of issue with either one of these. The Quinn does include this nice little stop, so you can say, I only want to strip, this much insulation on it. But that's neither here nor there. You'll notice that these both also use that anvil style cutting edge. And include crimpers, but you'll notice no sharp points on any of the crimping dies compared to this set here. So, and then that brings me to this Doyle set, which is really what triggered talking about this. I originally intended to shoot an unboxing. I had to replace mine after damaging it, which thankfully it's lifetime warranted. But these, you'll notice I have a large bypass cutting area. I have well marked, laser etched, stranded and solid markings for what wire I'm stripping, and a lot of surface that actually just cuts into the jacket. You can see they meet here, and then this continues to close another, 5 degrees, and actually cut into the jacket of the wire. And depending on what you're stripping, that's actually fairly important. In addition to just a couple of nice to haves that you see on some of these cheaper units as well, is this has got these little jaws that are supposed to be for grabbing and bending the wire. I've got a much larger pair of jaws. I still get my bolt cutter. In addition, this does have a basic, but it has a crimping surface, which you're not going to want to use this for anything super high precision crimping, but if I'm just crimping terminals on like 14 gauge wire or doing automotive work type of stuff, that's going to be fine. Okay, so that was just a quick introduction to the different wire strippers that I have here. And obviously these all live in different market segments, and I'm basically going to line them up on my bench here from lowest end to highest and talk about who they all are for. So these three are generally entry-level products. You're not doing this kind of stuff every day. Like I said, this one tends to be included with a kit, and quite frankly, if you just need to cut or strip 2 wires, you're splicing something in to fix a tail light on a car, and this came in the kit from the auto parts store, you're fine. You don't need to worry about anything else on this bench. It'll cut it, it'll strip it, it'll crimp your connection, and you're going to go on with life. And then you're never going to use it again. And that's why these exist. I hate them, but they have a reason to exist. Same for these two. If you're doing some light electronics work, my first Raspberry Pi blinking LED project type thing, they're going to be fine. In fact, this one, this nice spring-loaded one, I've seen actual electricians use tools like this because, quite frankly, it's good enough and small enough to keep in their bag, and they're generally happy with it. Not so much this GE one. I, in fact, think I had one that came like this in my toolkit when I was a digital electronics student, and I never liked it. But this, it's nice, it's spring-loaded. The bolt cutters probably aren't too fantastic, but beyond that, anything from 8 to 18, you're good to go. I honestly don't use these two to strip wire. In fact, what I use those two for, more often than not, is running Ethernet. Now, they'll strip wire, but, and we'll go to the focus for this, what I'll typically do is I'll take my Ethernet, and I will rip the jacket off the end so that I can crimp it or put a punch down or something like that on it. And this little anvil cutter is enough to cut through a section of Ethernet. It's not as good and struggles with shielded cable as something like the Doyle, but I keep, and we'll show that the Quinn can do the same stuff, I keep this in my box that I use for running Ethernet all the time because it works just fine for that. And just as a demonstration, let's try and cut this with the cheap bow. And, well, it got through it, but that took a fair amount of force compared to the other two, and it threw the bit of wire at my camera, which is neat. So anyway, you can use these for stripping wire, and I'm going to do that in a little bit. These are self-adjusting. You just adjust the tension to control a certain amount of force that it'll apply. But that's it. And then this one lives in my tool bag every day. I use it as a pair of needle nose pliers. I use it to cut things. I use it to strip wire. I have found that this is almost good enough. I don't need needle nose pliers regularly, but not quite. The jaw is just a little too short for me to not carry needle nose pliers. All the tools that I've got out here are like $25 or less. I think this is $24.99. These are both fairly inexpensive in the under 20 price bracket, and you'll see tools like this one for like $7.99. I wouldn't buy either of these. They exist, you can buy them. I'll give a link to something in that range, but realistically, those are what's coming free with your kit. So, that's all the different wire strippers that I have easy access to. That's 6. Now, realistically, I'd love to do a big, rigorous scientific analysis on all of them, the way Project Farm did recently, and I'll link to his video in my description where he goes through a couple of different wire strippers, but I don't have enough to do that, and a bunch of these came from the same brand anyway. Like, these 3 all came from Harbor Freight. So that's not representative of the Klein that this is nearly identical to, the Milwaukee that this is nearly identical to. Although I can say that this represents that general style, well, I can't compare it to those without them. So as things go forward, I would like to revisit this when I have access to more of these. To which note, definitely use our links in the description if you see something that's interesting, because it's stuff like, and leave a comment if you want to see a follow-up on that type. So let's start with this random, does it even say? So this random spool of 18 gauge wire. And I'm just going to cut a section, which that cut just fine. And we're going to try stripping it using the appropriate marked hole. Oh, and it did it, but that sucked. And next up, see, these that I said are generally crap. I could hack around in that. In fact, let's go ahead and put it under the focus here. I could keep chewing on that and eventually cut through it, but that was not a good experience there. So I'm going to cut this clean with the Doyles and then try the stripping section of that same plier. So we're just going to cut it clean. And this is 18 gauge stranded, which is another thing that this model is missing. In fact, all the models from the really cheap one is missing as well. You'll notice that this has wire gauges on both sides and says solid on both sides and says solid on one side. Does it say stranded on the other? Yeah, it says stranded on the other. Solid and stranded wire acts differently. And typically, the solid wire gauge is one step lower. So the hole that I would use for 16 gauge solid is for 18 gauge stranded. So I'm going to try the 18 on this. I don't actually know. I may have to go down to 16 to see if that works. So let's go ahead. We'll start at 18. And that worked. Not bad. Okay. Next up, self-adjusting pair. Cut no problem. These actually strip in this direction. Beautiful. And what I like about these is I don't care what gauge the wire is. There's a range that it works in. I'm not going to fit, double 0 gauge wire in there, obviously. But they, quote unquote, just work. And here's the Quinn. And same thing. No problem. Depending on what you're doing, the fact that the self-adjusting style will tend to leave the stripped portion of the insulation on is actually beneficial, especially when you're working with stranded wire, because I can then take it and give it a good twist like that. So if I'm running, I don't know, audio cable or something like that, being able to just take my stranded wire and give it a good twist, I can tin it with solder and get a nice connection that way. That's fantastic. And we're gonna cut it. And I said this was 18 gauge stranded. Just like that. The self-adjusting wire strippers generally require less pulling force because it's part of the mechanism. Whereas all the way from the lowest to the highest end of this, well, I have to pull. So depending on how much insulation gets cut and the type of insulation, I'm pulling against it. So that's 18 gauge, and that's fine. Let's go ahead and try something a bit heavier. I've got bins full of these, so I just grabbed a random power cord, and let's see if it's marked as to what gauge it is. It should be 16 or 14. It says 16. 3 16 gauge wires. So here's a good example. I can cut that with that. This also works, actually. I didn't expect that to cut through. Not bad. That was the one that wouldn't cut. Or no, that wasn't the one. Yeah, see, same thing here. This particular one is not great. little bit fussier with the self-adjusting because they use that anvil style, but they both cut through. Now, one thing that I can do with the self-adjusting strippers that I can't do with any of the others here is rip the outer jacket off of this cable. So if I was just putting a new end on a section of cable like this, these self-adjusting strippers replace the let me slice into it carefully with my pocket knife type cleanup that people would have to do, and I can just rip the jacket off like that, and now I'm ready to put a new, which end did I cut off? A new socket on this end. So there's that, but with that said, let's go ahead and pull off a larger section of that. Oh, come on. Alright, so with a little fiddling, I've got 2.5 inches or so of exposed 16 gauge, and this appears to be stranded. So same thing, we're just going to work our way up. 16. See? The fact that those don't meet, I can put that in the 16 gauge hole, and I don't know, maybe this is marked for solid core wire. No, not even close. Okay, well, that's a bummer. So next up is this little GE one, and same thing, we're going to line up for 16, and it didn't rip off half the jacket. Lovely. Well, will it cut at least? No. So, gonna cut it. And I know it's 16 gauge stranded. These are not doing so hot on the 16 gauge stranded. Same thing, I'm getting these little flyaways where it's not stripping the wire all the way around. Now, in a pinch, I can fold that back and just ignore it, or I can clip it off, but realistically, I shouldn't have to. Let's go ahead, and we're going to move up to one of the self-adjustings. Worked as intended. The next self-adjusting. Beautiful. And none of the more traditional design strippers have actually worked on this 16 gauge wire, so I'm not 100% sure if these will either. So that is 16 gauge, and that worked fine. Okay, well, I have spent, I don't know, 30 minutes or so rambling about these different wire cutters, and cut up an old power cable and a spare section of Ethernet. Realistically, folks, it matters what tool you use if you're doing something a lot. And what I mean by that is, you saw that this one didn't want to strip the 16 gauge wire. Actually, neither did this one. And neither one of these wanted to really consistently cut things. So these two styles in general are not going to be your friend. And the biggest giveaway, if a wire stripper is going to do what you want and is well produced, is to look at the blade. If the blades don't meet when you close the handle, if they are covered in paint, if there's a bunch of slop in the mechanism, you're not going to be happy using it. These four, although I had a couple of issues with this one on the 16 gauge, I probably could have just moved it down one hole size and been fine. These four were fine. Now, once again, you have to keep in mind what you're doing. There's a reason that I own a conventional pair and a self-adjusting pair. I use these for ripping the jackets off a wire all the time. I use this for everything else. Like, this lives in my tool bag with the rest of my pliers and everything. This lives in a box that I specifically get out when I'm running Ethernet. Functionally, there's no reason if you were an electrician, you wouldn't be happy with those. And it's all based on what you're doing. Now, there are shortcomings with any tool. This specifically, as much as I like it, will not strip smaller than 20 gauge wire. In fact, I've got this Ethernet here. And this cable should be, I believe, 26 gauge? 23 gauge. So if I take a section of 23 gauge wire, we'll go ahead and untwist brown because that's got the fewest twists. I can grab it with the smallest opening on this wire stripper and it passes right through. In fact, I don't think any of these, this one maybe says it goes down to 22. So this one will. 22 and 23 are close enough that worked. Realistically, even the self-adjusting sometimes has trouble with small wire like this. You'll notice I had to push down on the gripping anvil because this wire doesn't have enough jacket to it to consistently engage the self-adjusting portion. In fact, this one actually, I have the tension set too high. It just ripped the wire in half. So I actually still need to get a smaller set, and it'll probably be more similar to this than this for like that 30 to 20 gauge wire section. That's on my to-do list when I finally figure out what I want to do with the stash of Raspberry Pis that I have collecting dust. Because I'm sure a lot of that will be lower gauge wire than I normally use. Anyway, this is not a full in-depth analysis of every wire stripper on the market. I'd love to cover more of them. If somebody has a specific model that they're curious about or a specific type, I know I didn't even cover the pistol grip style automatic wire strippers because I just don't own one. I've never needed one. Let me know in the comments below. Some of these wire strippers were loaned to us by viewers of the channel, and some of these were purchased using Amazon affiliate funds. It is support like that that helps make content like this possible, and something that I encourage going forward if you'd like to see a more in-depth roundup where I can, get them under a microscope, check all the blades, check them for damage, measure exactly how much force using a strain gauge is required to pull the wire through some of these, because realistically the difference between this and this, on camera they looked the same. Now the difference in my hand between 5 pounds of force versus 10, well, if I don't have a way to measure it, I can't tell you. Anyway, with all that said, as always, our opening and closing themes were provided by Electrics. Go ahead and check him out in the description below. I encourage users who have questions to either leave comments or join us on our Discord channel. There'll be a link to that in the description below. And finally, thank you for watching.